That was the private reveal. My role was not visible enough to be protected, but critical enough to be missed once it stopped operating at full capacity. I didn't feel powerful, I felt sober. Because leverage like that comes with responsibility. You can use it recklessly or you can use it cleanly. I had no interest in humiliating anyone or watching things burn. That kind of outcome would have cost me too. What I wanted was alignment, to be seen accurately, or if that wasn't possible, to no longer be complicit in a system that depended on my invisibility. I realized then that any meaningful change would be irreversible, not because of consequences, but because once you stop propping something up quietly, you can't pretend it never needed support. That night, I closed my notebook and made a decision that wasn't yet an action, but a direction. I would stop correcting the narrative indirectly, and I would choose a path that didn't require permission. There's a moment, once you see the structure clearly, when you realize that doing nothing is also a decision. I spent a long time sitting with that. I could stay. That was one option. Continue as I was, now with clearer eyes, manage my boundaries better, speak up selectively, advocate for myself within the system. On paper, it was the most reasonable choice, stable, predictable, safe. But when I imagined that future, something tightened in my chest. Because staying would have required me to keep explaining myself to people who benefited from not fully understanding my role. It would have meant negotiating for visibility in a system that only noticed you when you disrupted its comfort. And most of all, it would have meant trusting that incremental change would be honored by people who had grown accustomed to my silence. Another option was confrontation. I could have asked for a meeting, laid everything out calmly, named the patterns, requested clearer ownership, clearer recognition, clearer pathways forward. I knew how to do that conversation well. I could have made it measured, professional, and unimpeachable. But I also knew how those conversations tend to end, with nods, with reassurances, with promises to be more mindful. And then slowly, with a return to default. Not out of malice, but inertia. The system wasn't broken, it was efficient for everyone except the person absorbing its friction. There was a third option, the one I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider until then. I could leave, not impulsively, not dramatically, but deliberately. On my terms, with my integrity intact and my understanding complete. Leaving wasn't about punishment, it wasn't about making a point. It was about refusing to continue lending my energy to a structure that required me to remain unseen to function smoothly. I thought about Daniel, about how confused he would be, not because he had set out to take anything from me, but because he had never been required to notice where it came from. I didn't hate him. I didn't even resent him anymore. I just didn't want my future tethered to his blind spots. I thought about the firm, about how much of its resilience rested on informal labor that no one had bothered to formalize. How fragile that made it, not because of me, but because of its assumptions. And I thought about myself, about how tired I was of being reasonable at my own expense, of translating my value into palatable fragments, of waiting for recognition to arrive organically in a system that rewarded assertion, not patience. The irreversible choice wasn't leaving itself. I decided that I would no longer shape my life around being quietly useful. Once that decision was settled, everything else became logistical. I didn't tell anyone yet. I just stopped imagining a future there. And that, more than anything, changed how I moved through the next few weeks. Calm, focused, and completely unattached to outcomes I was no longer responsible for preserving. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. That surprised me. I had expected anxiety or at least a sense of countdown. Instead, I felt precise, detached in a way that sharpened my focus rather than dulling it. I began to prepare quietly. I updated my resume, not by inflating anything, but by naming my work accurately for the first time. Processes I had supported became systems I had designed and maintained. Initiatives I had assisted with became cross-functional implementations I had coordinated end to end. Seeing it written plainly was sobering. not because it was impressive, but because it was true. I reached out to a few contacts I trusted, former colleagues, people who had seen me work without the internal distortion of my current environment. I didn't complain. I didn't explain. I simply said I was open to conversations. Those conversations moved faster than I expected. In parallel, I began transferring knowledge, but only through official channels. If someone asked for documentation, I provided exactly what was requested. No more, no less. I stopped filling in gaps informally. If something wasn't written down, it stayed that way unless someone took responsibility for it. No one noticed at first. From the outside, everything still functioned. Projects progressed, deadlines were met, but the system had lost its cushion. Minor delays became visible. Questions that used to be answered in minutes now took hours, sometimes days, as they moved through proper channels. Daniel seemed busier. He asked more follow-up questions, scheduled more check-ins. I answered them calmly, efficiently, without anticipating what might come next. There was no malice in any of it, just alignment. I also paid attention to timing. I didn't want my departure to coincide with a crisis, not out of loyalty, but because I didn't want the narrative to become about disruption. I wanted it to be about transition. An offer came through sooner than I expected. Different firm, smaller team, clear role, explicit ownership. The compensation was fair, but what mattered more was the language. They described the work in terms of authorship, not support. I accepted without hesitation. Still, I didn't announce anything yet. I continued to show up, continued to do my job, continued to be calm. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about not seeking validation while you reposition yourself. It's about letting decisions solidify before you expose them to other people's interpretations. By the time I finally scheduled a meeting with my manager, everything that mattered was already done. All that remained was to state a fact. I gave notice on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesdays are symbolic, but because it was the first open slot on my manager's calendar that didn't feel rushed. I wanted the conversation to be unhurried, clean. She was surprised, but not alarmed. At first, she thanked me for being transparent, asked the usual questions. Was this about growth? About compensation? About workload? I answered honestly without offering a narrative. I said I had accepted a role that aligned more clearly with how I work and what I'm responsible for. She nodded, took notes, said she understood. The shift didn't happen in that room. It happened over the next few days. Questions began to surface. Small ones at first. Where a document lived? Why did the process take longer than expected? Who usually confirms a particular detail? People asked casually, assuming quick answers. I responded, but I didn't compensate. I pointed to the documentation. I redirected to the owners. I said, I'm not sure. Daniel might know, when that was the formal truth. By the end of the week, calendars were filling with meetings titled things like process review and knowledge transfer. People spoke more slowly, asked more carefully. There was a faint edge of concern, not panic, just the early awareness of friction. Daniel stopped by my desk more often. He asked how I was feeling about the transition, if I were excited, if there was anything he could do to make the handoff smoother. His tone was friendly, but beneath it was something else, recalibration. He was starting to realize that what he had perceived as shared understanding had been privately maintained. Leadership noticed next, not in a dramatic way, just questions that began with, Catherine usually handles this, right? Followed by, who will own it now? The answers were slower, less confident. No one blamed anyone. That's important. There was no villain assigned, just a growing awareness that something foundational had been assumed rather than designed. The consequences didn't arrive in the form of a collapse. They arrived as an effort. More emails, more meetings, more cross-checks. Work that had once moved quietly now required visible labor. People felt the loss not as absence but as weight, and still no one said it out loud, because admitting dependence requires admitting oversight. I stayed present, helpful, professional. I didn't hoard information or withdraw cooperation, but I also didn't perform miracles. I allowed the system to experience itself without my constant correction. By the time my last 2 weeks began, the atmosphere had changed. Not hostile, just alert. As if everyone was suddenly aware of how much had been happening without their noticing. And that awareness, once formed, doesn't disappear. It only deepens. The second week after my notice, the tone shifted again. Not dramatically. No emergency meetings, no raised voices, just a subtle change in how carefully people spoke, like they were trying to handle something fragile without naming it. Leadership started asking questions that sounded retrospective. Why is this process structured this way? When did we decide this? Who validated that assumption? They weren't accusatory questions. They were the kinds of questions you ask when you realize the map you've been using doesn't match the terrain. Daniel looked tired. He was still competent, still composed, but the ease was gone. He was now the one absorbing the friction, fielding follow-ups, translating gaps, trying to reconstruct context that had never been written down because it had lived comfortably in me. At one point, he asked if I could stay on as a consultant for a few weeks after my departure, just to help stabilize things. The request was careful, respectful, almost apologetic. I told him I couldn't, not because I wanted to make a point, but because I had already accepted a role that required my full attention, and because stepping back in would have reinforced the very pattern I had chosen to leave. That was the moment I saw it land. Not anger, not blame, regret. Not the loud kind. The quiet realization that something had been misjudged, not maliciously but conclusively. The system had relied on continuity without acknowledging its source, and now that source was no longer available to smooth the edges. People tried to fix things quickly. Ownership was reassigned, documentation was requested, but these were reactive measures. They lacked the texture of lived understanding. You can't recreate years of quiet calibration in a few meetings. I was invited into conversations about what we could have done differently. I answered honestly, but without reopening myself. I named structural issues, not personal ones. I didn't say I warned you. I said this is how it functioned. By then, it was clear. Even if things improved, they wouldn't improve for me. And that's the part people often misunderstand. Sometimes repair comes too late, not because it's insufficient, but because the person who needed it has already moved on. On my last day, there were kind words, sincere ones. People thanked me for my contributions. Someone said, "We didn't realize how much you were holding together." I believed them, but realization after loss isn't the same as recognition in time. I packed my desk calmly, said goodbye, left without ceremony. And as I walked out, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The confrontation everyone imagines never really happened. There was no final showdown. No moment where I listed grievances or watched someone falter under the weight of truth. What happened instead was quieter and in its own way more final. On my last afternoon, Daniel asked if we could talk, just the two of us. He suggested the small meeting room near the back, the one with the frosted glass that muffled sound without feeling secretive. I agreed. He closed the door gently, sat across from me, took a breath before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said. Not rehearsed, not defensive, just direct. He told me he hadn't realized how much I'd been carrying, that he had assumed things were fine because I never pushed back. That he saw now how often he had stepped into space that wasn't really his to take, simply because it was available. I listened. I didn't rush to reassure him. I didn't soften the moment. I let the silence hold. Then I said the only thing that felt true. "I don't think you set out to take anything from me," I said. "But intention doesn't change impact." And I stayed quiet longer than I should have. That was it. No list, no emotional release, just two facts placed side by side. He nodded, looked down at the table, said he wished we'd had this conversation sooner. I believed him, but I also knew that the version of me who could have that conversation earlier no longer existed. She had done her job. of surviving, of learning, of clarifying boundaries through experience. We talked briefly about the transition, about what he'd do differently going forward. I wished him well, and I meant it. There was no reconciliation arc, no dramatic closure, just understanding, arriving after it could no longer change the outcome. When we stood to leave, he said, "You were never invisible to me." I paused. Then I said, "Visibility isn't about being noticed, it's about being acknowledged in time." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. That was the confrontation. Calm, minimal, honest. And when I walked out of that room, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. The person I am now would look familiar to my younger self, but she would feel unfamiliar from the inside. I didn't become louder. I didn't suddenly turn assertive in a way that feels performative or unnatural. I still speak calmly. I still think before I talk. I still value precision over volume. From the outside, many people would say, I haven't changed much at all. But internally, the shift is structural. The most important thing I unlearned was the belief that restraint is automatically a virtue. For a long time, I equated self-control with moral high ground. I believed that not needing recognition meant I was evolved. Not reacting meant I was strong. That absorbing discomfort quietly was a sign of emotional intelligence. Sometimes it is. But when restraint becomes habitual, when it's never chosen, only defaulted to, it stops being integrity and starts being erasure. I no longer confuse silence with depth. In my current role, I do many of the same things I did before. I design systems, I notice inefficiencies, I anticipate downstream consequences. I care deeply about quality and continuity. Those parts of me were never the problem. What changed is how I relate to my own labor. I name what I own without apology, not defensively, not aggressively, just clearly. When I build something, I document it early and attach my name to it, not because I need validation, but because authorship creates accountability for everyone. I speak earlier in conversations now, not to dominate them, but to establish context before narratives form without me. I've learned that the first framing often becomes the permanent one. Waiting to add value later is a gamble I no longer take. And when something doesn't belong to me, I let it fall where it may. That was one of the hardest lessons, allowing consequences to land on the people who made the decisions. I used to intercept problems instinctively, smoothing things over before anyone else even felt them. I told myself I was being helpful. What I was actually doing was protecting others from learning. Now I intervene intentionally, or not at all. This hasn't made me colder. It's made me calmer, less reactive, less resentful. When you stop carrying things that aren't yours, you free up an enormous amount of emotional bandwidth. You stop needing recognition because you're no longer leaking value invisibly. I also stop performing gratitude for basic respect. I don't over-explain my boundaries. I don't soften them to make them more digestible. If something isn't sustainable for me, I say so. Briefly, without drama, and I don't feel the need to justify it with exhaustion or sacrifice. Quiet dominance, I've learned, isn't about control or superiority. It's about self-definition, about deciding internally where you end and where responsibility should transfer, about being so clear with yourself that other people adjust automatically. I'm still dependable, still thoughtful, still steady under pressure, but I'm no longer interchangeable. I don't regret the years I spent being invisible. They taught me how systems really function. They showed me the difference between being appreciated and being relied upon. And they clarified something I now carry with me everywhere. Being essential is not enough. If your presence is required but your absence is unimaginable, the system is broken, not you. I didn't leave with bitterness. I left with calibration, a more accurate understanding of my value and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing I will never again disappear just to keep things running smoothly. I'm still calm. I am still composed. I am just no longer available for roles that require me to shrink in order to belong. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to package everything into a single sharp lesson, something neat, something actionable, something that fits comfortably into a quote. Speak up sooner. Know your worth. Don't let people take advantage of you. All of those ideas are true, and still they miss something important. Because what happened to me wasn't the result of one bad decision or one flawed person. It was the result of a system that quietly rewards those who occupy space and quietly relies on those who don't. A system where visibility is mistaken for value and silence is mistaken for consent. For a long time, I thought fairness was automatic, that if you contributed meaningfully, it would eventually be recognized, that integrity had its own momentum. What I learned instead is that systems don't respond to integrity alone. They respond to clarity. Clarity about ownership, clarity about boundaries, clarity about where your responsibility ends. Without that clarity, even good people can benefit from an imbalance without ever intending to cause harm. The coworker who did nothing didn't wake up one morning and decide to take everything from me. He stepped into space that existed because I had been conditioned by culture, by expectations, by my own beliefs to leave it empty. Not because I was weak, but because I believed restraint was synonymous with maturity. That belief kept me safe for a long time, and then it kept me small. This story isn't a warning against collaboration or generosity. I still believe deeply in both. It's a reminder that generosity without limits becomes self-erasure, and collaboration without authorship becomes extraction. It's also a reminder that silence is never neutral, even when it's well-intentioned. Even when it feels peaceful, silence teaches people what they can assume, and assumptions, once formed, are difficult to reverse. The hardest truth I had to accept wasn't that others failed to see me. It was that I had helped build a version of myself that required no acknowledgement to function. Leaving wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of alignment. A refusal to keep donating unseen labor to a system that didn't know how to account for it. A decision to stop proving my value through endurance. And here's the part that still surprises me. I don't carry anger from that chapter. I carry information. Information about how easily roles solidify, about how rarely systems correct themselves without friction, about how calm people are often mistaken for content people. Most of all, I carry a clearer relationship with myself. I no longer wait to be seen. I make myself legible. I no longer equate being needed with being respected. I no longer disappear to preserve harmony. If this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever been the person who quietly held things together while others moved freely around you, I hope you don't hear this as a criticism. I hope you hear it as permission. Permission to stop compensating in silence. Permission to let consequences teach what explanation never could. Permission to choose yourself without needing to justify the choice. So I'll leave you with the question that changed everything for me, the one I wish I had asked myself much earlier. What would actually happen if you stopped making it so easy for people not to notice what you carry? If this resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your experience. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that your silence was being mistaken for agreement? Tell me in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.